couple of practical points before we commence the formalities. We tried to order further copies of Frank's book, but it's out of print already. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. You would have noticed the sculptures of Benelong and Barangaroo welcoming you at the entrance to the crypt. They are a constant reminder to us all here at St Patrick's and beyond that we're not the first to set foot on this soil. In 1994, I was part of a group that decided to promote conversation for renewal in the Catholic Church. The name of the group is Catalyst For Renewal. Over the years of walking together, we've learned much about conversation. In particular, we've come to the conviction that a willingness to change is a prerequisite for true conversation. We've also expanded our vision beyond the Catholic Church. We believe that true conversation can bring much to Australian society, especially as we address the serious issues facing us all at this time. Catalyst For Renewal joins with St Patrick's Parish to present this forum on the referendum with Father Frank Brennan. In his recent book, An Indigenous Voice to Parliament, Frank writes on page 18, "Some voters will be committed to voting yes, regardless of the small print in the constitutional amendment. Others will be dyed-in-the-wool no voters, regardless of what any lawyer or politician might say about the proposed amendment. But there will be a sizable group of voters with a natural hesitance about amending our Constitution, preferring or even demanding coherent explanations for the yes case before casting their ballot. Frank says it's primary for them that I write, and I'm assuming it's primarily for those that you will address us this afternoon, Frank. And on page 72, if ever there was a public policy issue requiring respectful engagement, this is it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Father Frank Brennan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and great to be with you, and thank you for that very gracious introduction, Michael. And I join with you, the parish of St Patrick's, acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the place we now call Sydney. Great to see you turning out in such large numbers on a very wet afternoon. There's obviously a lot to talk about, isn't there? I'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. And we'll record my presentation, but we won't record the Q&A, so there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to say whatever you'd like and to make observations. Let's start here with a touch of local history. You're probably aware that in 1809, one William Davis was given a land grant in this part of Sydney. So what, it was only 21 years after the establishment of the penal colony here. And of course, as was the case back then, no recognition of the traditional rights of the Aboriginal people to their lands. Davis then featured in the early Catholic history, where he assisted with the what is often described as the inept and short-lived 6-month ministry of Father Jeremiah O'Flynn, who came in November 1817, but Governor Macquarie had him removed in May 1818. It is said that the Eucharist may well have been kept at Davis's home at or about this place for 18 months until the French chaplain then arrived in November 1819. And in 1840, Davis donated part of his land grant to the church on which St Patrick's is now built, gifting that section and he also gave a donation of £1,000, which I understand assisted considerably with the building of the church. With that background, let's contemplate something of last week's events. On Thursday, a crowd gathered in Parliament House declaring good news as the Attorney-General introduced a bill entitled The Constitution Alteration Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice 2023. He quoted Senator Patrick Dodson, the founder and father of reconciliation, who said the bill will be a moment of liberation for all of us. The moment the referendum is declared, we will feel the shackles of the past fall from us. We will all stand with a clean heart and a clean conscience. Well, the public gallery was packed with rejoicing Indigenous leaders. The government side of the House was packed to the gills with members in a celebratory mood. The teals and crossbenches were the same, but the opposition coalition benches were almost empty and without much enthusiasm being displayed. As you know, a referendum needs mass support to succeed. We need to talk respectfully and cautiously as we speak about the nation's soul. We need a process and a formula of words, not only to get us to yes, but to get us to an overwhelming vote of yes that unites the country rather than dividing us. And there's still a lot of work to do. On the same day the bill was introduced to our Parliament, a joint statement, by coincidence, was issued in Rome by the Vatican's dicasteries for culture and education and for promoting integral human development on what used to be called the doctrine of discovery. Vatican officials said they'd been listening to Indigenous peoples and that the Church has heard the importance of addressing the concept referred to as the doctrine of discovery. This doctrine was espoused by European colonisers for hundreds of years as a justification for settlers being granted an exclusive right to extinguish, either by purchase or conquest, the title to or possession of those lands by Indigenous peoples, the sort of title which was granted to William Davis here in 1809. Often the colonisers invoked various 15th century papal decrees as authorisation, justification or excuse for their actions. The Vatican authorities admitted last week that these papal bulls did not adequately reflect the equal dignity and rights of Indigenous peoples. The Church is also aware that the contents of these documents were manipulated for political purposes by competing colonial powers in order to justify immoral acts against Indigenous peoples that were carried out at times without opposition from ecclesiastical authorities. The dicasteries did point out that even as far back as the 17th century, there were more enlightened papal decrees, such as Sublimis Deus, in which Pope Paul III wrote, "We define and declare that the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possessions of their property, even though they be outside the Christian faith, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect." Might I remind you, that was said by Pope Paul III in the 17th century, 200 years before the establishment of the penal colony here at Sydney Cove. I think at this time, after the declaration last week in Parliament, it behoves us to recall some of the words spoken by Pope John Paul II when he met with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians at Alice Springs in November 1986. So now, 35 more years ago. "The establishment of a new society for Aboriginal people," he said, "cannot go forward without just and mutually recognised agreements with regard to these human problems, even though their causes lie in the past. The greatest value to be achieved by such agreements, which must be implemented without causing new injustices, is respect for the dignity and growth of the human person. So it's with that church background that I'd like to come and address the questions which are now before us in terms of the forthcoming referendum. Now, I hope most of you have access to the handout, which is entitled The Path to a Referendum from Uluru via Ghana to Canberra and on to the people. I'm not going to address everything in that handout, but it might be a useful aide-memoire for you to take home, but also it gives you a few pointers in the discussion. When it comes to a referendum in Australia, I need to make a few points with something of the constitutional legal history. Let's remember the Australian Constitution is very democratic in one particular sense. The preamble of our Constitution states unequivocally that it was the people who decided to join the Commonwealth, to bring together the 6 colonies which became the Commonwealth of Australia. It was not enough for a vote simply of the colonial parliaments, nor enough simply for a vote of the Imperial Parliament. It was that the people, we the people, voted to establish the Federation under the Australian Constitution. That's one bookend, the beginning of the Constitution or the preamble. At the tail end of the Constitution is section 128. And that section specifies the means by which the Australian Constitution can be amended. Yes, it requires an Act of Parliament, as was introduced in the bill last week, but it then requires a majority of voters in support, and it requires a supermajority. Not just a majority of voters, but then a majority of the voters in at least 4 of the 6 states. Very difficult to achieve. And it has only ever been achieved in the past in Australia with bipartisan support, by which I mean agreement on both sides of the parliamentary chamber in putting to the Australian people that we think this is a proposal for which you should vote. There have been 44 attempts to amend the Australian Constitution, and only 8 have succeeded. And I'm not at a gathering like this to make party political points, but even Mr Murphy here, who used to be a Labor member, would be able to attest the Labor Party has made 25 attempts to amend the Australian Constitution, and they have failed 24 times. And the one successful referendum that Labor put forward, I dare to suggest there's no one here in this packed hall who voted for it, because you have to be over 97 years of age. It was in 1946. And it was relation to social security payments, things like child endowment, maternity allowances, an extension of the welfare net to everybody. What we're talking about with this forthcoming referendum is a very different proposition. It's not about saying we'll change the Constitution in the same way for everybody. It is saying we are proposing to the Australian people a specific change to the Constitution specifically for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. As I say, a huge ask in terms of looking at the history of constitutional referendums. We did have a successful referendum in 1967, which was vote yes for Aborigines. No one put forward a no case, and it was carried by over 90%. All it did, in fact, was to take out the 2 negative references to Aborigines which occurred in the Constitution. And everyone said that was good news. But ever since then, we've had a building crescendo, particularly amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, saying, look, we're not even mentioned in the founding document of Australia. We should be recognised in the Constitution. And I'd be bold enough to suggest that most Australians in the 21st century accept the principle that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders should be recognised in some way in the Constitution. In terms of how that is to be done, it was an issue which started to come to the boil really in the early 1990s. And one of the leaders of this was an old friend of mine, Lowitja O'Donoghue, a very respected Aboriginal leader. She was the head of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. You'll remember we had a Prime Minister at that time, one Paul J. Keating, and he wanted Australia to become a republic. So he chose another young fellow by the name of Malcolm Turnbull, who hadn't yet chosen his party political allegiances, to head what was called the Republican Advisory Committee. And Lowitja O'Donoghue was a member of that Republican Advisory Committee. And she, as the head of ATSIC, proposed that there should be a new preamble put in the Australian Constitution which would recognise something of Aboriginal history, something of the present Aboriginal reality, and something of Aboriginal hopes and aspirations. And from 1993 till 2007, that was the received wisdom. That's what everyone was talking about. How could we get a preamble placed in the Australian Constitution, and what would it be, and what would be the formula of words? Culminating on the eve of the 2007 election, John Howard had his back to the wall, Kevin Rudd was coming through on the rails, and John Howard gave a talk at the Sydney Institute, and he said what's there in the first quote on the 11th of October 2007. If re-elected, I will put to the Australian people within 18 months a referendum to formally recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution. Their history as the first inhabitants of our country, their unique heritage of culture and languages, and their special, though not separate, place within a reconciled, indivisible nation. Well, John Howard lost the election, Kevin Rudd got elected, and you'll remember that he went ahead immediately with the apology to the stolen generations. And he said he would deal with constitutional recognition in his second term. Well, not everything you wish for comes to pass, and you'll be aware that Julia Gillard became the Prime Minister. To get her majority in the Parliament, she needed to cut some deals with independents and the Greens. And part of the deal was that there would be an expert panel set up which would look at the question of Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. So it's back in 2012 where for the first time, I think history shows, that we have a new breed of Aboriginal leaders who say, we are not satisfied simply with recognition in the Constitution. We're not interested in minimal symbolic language. Now, I'm an old fuddy-duddy white fellow Australian. I've often thought there's a lot to be said for minimal symbolic language, like in 1967, but which is carried by an overwhelming 90% of the population, which then creates the political imperative for real change. But that argument has lost out. So this new breed of Aboriginal leaders said, we want something substantive. And on that expert panel were people like those who have now become familiar names, people like Noel Pearson. And the central plank they put forward was that they wanted a provision put in the Constitution which was a prohibition on racial discrimination. And I put it there as the second quote. This is not a class in constitutional law, so I won't go into great detail, except to say two things. The idea of putting such a clause in a constitution where you don't have a general Bill of Rights was very problematic. Second, where the country had been through two excruciating native title debates, first under Keating post-Mabo, and second under Howard post-Whig, the real arguments that went on both times were about the relationship between the Racial Discrimination Act on one hand and the Native Title Act on the other. It was essential for both Prime Ministers and for both Parliaments to deliver certainty, particularly to miners and pastoralists in relation to their titles, while at the same time trying to honour the Racial Discrimination Act. A very complex procedure, something that could not be achieved by a one-line entry in the Australian Constitution. So basically, that expert panel report was a dead letter the moment it was written. But we were all on notice, Aboriginal Australia saying we want something substantive. So they want something substantive, but what they put forward could not possibly fly. The next step, credit is due on both sides, to Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott, who was the leader of the opposition at the time. They could each see that this was something of a disaster, and they said, is there something we can retrieve and maintain as we move forward? And so they worked together, and an act was passed through the Australian Parliament unanimously, and that's quote 3. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People's Recognition Act. Parliament recognises that the continent and the islands now known as Australia were first occupied by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, something of the past. We acknowledge the continuing relationship of Aboriginal peoples with their traditional lands, the present reality. We acknowledge and respect the continuing cultures, language and heritage of Aboriginal people looking towards the future. I think it was a signal achievement, and I'm still one who would like to see words like that in the Australian Constitution. But basically the Aboriginal leaders ultimately, when they got to Uluru in 2017, said, we're no longer interested in anything minimal and symbolic like that, even if it's to be added to other provisions that we want. By 2017, they said, look, we know there are provisions of the Australian Constitution that contain the word race, leave them there. We know that there are people who would support something like that 2013 Act, we're not interested. In terms of the Constitution, we want something substantive. We can't have a racial non-discrimination clause. So in the Uluru Statement they said, we call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Abbott, as Prime Minister, had agreed that a referendum council would be established, which would include Aboriginal leaders and other respected leaders in the Australian community. Even included someone like Murray Gleeson, who'd been a very well-respected Chief Justice of New South Wales for 10 years and then Chief Justice of the High Court for 10 years. And the Referendum Council in June 2017 made one key recommendation, and that's quote 5. That a referendum be held to provide in the Australian Constitution for a representative body that gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations a voice to the Commonwealth Parliament, full stop. And for the purposes of the present discussion and what will go on in the coming months, I emphasise that full stop. No mention whatever of executive government in the recommendation made by the Referendum Council on 30th of June 2017. Murray Gleeson then gave a very significant address in 2019, where once again, as he outlined his arguments for what the Referendum Council had put forward, basically he spoke about there being a First Nations voice, which would be a voice to the Commonwealth Parliament. Well, then came a turn of the page. What we had was a situation, 3 Liberal Prime Ministers in a row had said no, outright, to a voice being placed in the Australian Constitution. First, we had the situation where Tony Abbott said, definitely not. Turnbull then said no, and said it would be something like a third chamber. And Morrison also said no. Labor, elected to government in 2022, Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister, what's he to do? Labor is wanting to prosecute the Uluru Statement. Labor is wanting to make the constitutional change. What is to be the approach? So, shortly after his election, Albanese at the Ghana Festival announced a formula of words. He was basically suggesting this would be a conversation starter. That these are words that could be considered. Happy to hear from anybody who might have different views. we want to try and get this right. So, where did those words come from? Basically, in 2018, there had been a parliamentary committee which had been chaired by Patrick Dodson, the father of reconciliation, and Julian Leeser, the shadow minister. And on that committee, there were people like Linda Burney, now the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and Mullendery McCarthy, the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Affairs. They received these 18 suggestions. For example, one of the suggestions was from Patrick Dodson himself, together with Warren Snowden, who'd been a long-time Labor member for the Northern Territory. Their submission was very simple, far too simple to put in the Constitution, but you could readily understand it. It said, there will be a voice to Parliament, full stop. It will not have a veto, full stop. Parliament will determine what it does, full stop. But the 18th suggestion that came in was submitted 2 months after the cut-off date, but it was put in by 3 very significant Indigenous leaders who had served on the Uluru panel. And they were Noel Pearson, Megan Davis and Pat Anderson. And basically, the submission they put in, the Parliamentary Committee said, well, this needs a lot more work. But they put it in nonetheless as one of the 18 which had come forward. Well, for whatever reason, Mr Albanese of Garma decided that that was basically the formula of words that he would put out as Prime Minister as the discussion started. That was at the end of July. Time started to roll on, and by early November, I, as an Australian citizen, passionate about trying to get something into the Constitution to recognise Indigenous Australians, I was becoming very worried. I was very worried because no process had been set up by the government in order to be able to have the conversation. And no process had been set up within the Parliament in order to try and get buy-in from the opposition. Now clearly, and we see it last night with the Aston by-election in Victoria, don't we? We're dealing with a new government which is riding high and an opposition which is really on the ropes. All of which is quite true in the political sense. But in terms of amending the Australian Constitution, when you've already got the National Party saying no, I think you've got to be doing something to try and get the Liberal Party to the table. If not their leader, if not all the Liberal Party, at least when you know that there are a couple of senior Liberals like Julian Leeser and Andrew Bragg who say we could be in support of something, then I think you need a process and you need a commitment to a formula of words that can try and get them to the table. This is in no way to abuse the Aboriginal leadership who have said what their preferred formula of words is. This is not simply legislation. This is not simply government policy. This is an attempt to change the Australian Constitution. And as Michael said at the outset, the critical part is to have those who are undecided having enough information and being content sufficiently about the process and being content sufficiently about the tightness of the words to be able to vote yes. There are lots of Australians who will vote yes regardless of any abuse of the political process, regardless of how wide the words are. There are lots of other Australians who will vote no. Doesn't matter how good the words are, how good the process, whatever. But in the middle are those who will decide the referendum. They're those who at this stage are undecided. And I argue strongly that we have to treat with them very respectfully. I got to write the book because on the 1st of December, the government, I thought, made a very tragic mistake. And I think they've implicitly admitted it ever since. On the 1st of December, they announced we will not distribute the usual yes-no pamphlet to voters because we now live in a digital age and people can get information by looking on the computer. The Australian Electoral Commission has claimed that up to 40% of voters have some recourse to the pamphlet when making a decision. And I've been to enough remote Aboriginal communities to know that they are not all computer literate. They mightn't all read a pamphlet left at their door, but they're more likely to do that than to go and access a computer and say, what might so-and-so be saying about the proposed referendum about us? So, what we've had is a situation where that had dragged on. So on the 9th of November, I wrote, I think, a very respectful letter to the Prime Minister, and I said, I think it is time that you set up a parliamentary committee, and I think it is time that you try to get a process which is bipartisan and where we can actually start the conversation as to what words would be put into the Constitution. Well, you may be aware he gave what could only be described as a train wreck of an interview with Ben Fordham on 2GB, where Fordham asked him, well, how do we get to start this conversation? The Prime Minister said to him, well, you've got my phone number. Well, that's no answer to getting to yes in terms of process that is needed. As I've said, I have every sympathy, and I've said this directly to the Prime Minister himself, every sympathy when you've had 3 Liberal Prime Ministers in a row saying no. Of course you're after a circuit breaker, but once you've set up the circuit breaker, you've got to then try and get the buy-in, and you've got to try and get the words right so that you can have buy-in from at least some of the key members on the opposition front bench. Well, what we've now come to is the announcement last week that the question that's going to be put to us at referendum is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? You'll be given a pencil, you'll go into a polling booth, and you'll simply tick or cross yes or no. If you vote yes, at the moment, this is the proposal in point 8 of the words that would be placed in the Constitution. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. The final point there on the sheet is the suggestion which I floated back in February, which was an attempt to see whether there might be the possibility of getting Liberal and Labor to come together on something. And I have to admit I failed spectacularly. Neither Labor nor Liberal was interested. But just to give you some background to it, I was suggesting there shall be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice with such structures and functions as the Parliament deems necessary to facilitate consultation prior to the making of special laws with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and with such other functions as the Parliament determines. I've always taken seriously the argument of those Conservatives who say we would prefer a constitution which has no special race-based provisions. That we think we are a federation and we live under a constitution where there is no discrimination of any sort. But having said that, Section 51(26) of our Commonwealth Constitution says the Commonwealth Parliament will have power to make laws with respect to the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. Now that was put in by our founding fathers, and they were all men back in the 19th century, in order that the Commonwealth Parliament could make laws which were adverse to particular racial groups, particularly the Chinese on the mining fields and the South Sea Islanders on the cane fields in Queensland. After the '67 referendum, when the words of exception relating to Aborigines in 51(26), a lot of people tried to argue, oh, well, there you are, 51(26) now, you'd never make laws about Aborigines, about South Sea Islanders or about Chinese, But you would make special laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and you would only make benign laws, or laws that they wanted. Well, no, 5126 was designed so that if necessary the Parliament could say, we are making an adverse law. You might remember there was a big kerfuffle years later with the Hindmarsh Island Bridge affair, where the Commonwealth Parliament legislated. Some Aboriginal people said, we don't want a law like that, we think it's adverse to our interests, which the High Court quite rightly said, no, 5126 allows the Commonwealth Parliament to make laws either benign or adverse for people of a particular race. So, to those of a conservative bent, I've always argued, if you maintain 5126 to make special laws with respect to a particular group, then surely in your constitution you must permit some provision where there would be guaranteed consultation with that group before special laws were made in relation to them. And so it seemed to me that that at least could be what Noel Pearson has often called the hook in the Constitution for the voice. That it would have a constitutional function to be constitutionally consulted whenever the Parliament wanted to make special laws with respect to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. And then once you had the hook in there, then you could give the voice all sorts of other functions to perform, but by Act of Parliament. So if need be, you could chop and change it in order to try and get it right. What we have at the moment is the proposal that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth. Now, this is the point, I think, of controversy at this stage, and it will be addressed in the coming weeks. As I've said to you, I was critical of the Prime Minister back in November that no parliamentary committee had been set up. This Tuesday, we are assured that it will be announced when we, the citizens, can make submissions to the parliamentary committee. But guess what? Next Tuesday is the 5th of April, or the 4th of April. The Parliamentary Committee has to report back to Parliament by the 15th of May. That will mean, I would think, that at the very latest, we will have until the end of this month in order to make submissions and for hearings to be held and for the advice of the Solicitor General to be obtained to see what the final wording might be. Now, this has probably been judged to be clever politics, but in terms of getting to yes with an overwhelming vote of the Australian people, which can create a sense of unity of the people, I think it's risky. I think it's crash or crash through. But in terms of the question about executive government, which I think is an expansion of what was there in the recommendation of the Referendum Council, if the Parliament is to put before us a referendum proposal, not just for a voice to Parliament, and not just a voice to ministers, but also to executive government, that means a voice to public servants, and it also means a voice to officers of Commonwealth agencies which are governed by statute. And in terms of the voice to Parliament, that of course would be in relation to laws existing or proposed future laws, which I think is very necessary. Or in relation to ministers, it would be in relation to policies and practices or proposed future policies. But if you have a constitutional entity, the voice, which has a constitutional entitlement to make representation to all public servants at the Commonwealth who are making decisions which relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that must include representations to public servants who are starting discussions about prospective policy or who are making routine administrative decisions about individual Aboriginal people. And I think that in constitutional terms is problematic. It was said a while ago that I was fear-mongering when at the Sydney Institute on the 1st of March, which was the last time I made a media statement about any of these things, that I pointed out that executive government could include the Reserve Bank, because the Reserve Bank is governed by the Reserve Bank Act. Well, forget about what Frank Brennan says. Let's take as gospel, as we must, what was written yesterday by Professor Megan Davis and her colleague Gabriel Appleby, Megan being the key Indigenous constitutional scholar involved with all of these negotiations. This is what they wrote in the Australian yesterday in their opinion piece. The Voice will be able to speak to all parts of the government, including the Cabinet, ministers, public servants and independent statutory officers and agencies, such as the Reserve Bank, as well as a wide array of other agencies, including, to name a few, Centrelink, the Great Barrier Marine Park Authority and the Ombudsman, on matters relating to Aboriginal people. This isn't to be feared. The Parliament will be able to set the procedure through which the Voice's representations are received. It can't shut the Voice up. It's important that the Voice speaks not just on matters that directly or explicitly affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but on matters that have an indirect but significant effect on them. My own view is I think it's all very well for a new government to say, well, let's legislate to allow the Voice to make representations to public servants and the Reserve Bank and all sorts of institutions on all manner of things, but put it in legislation so that if there are problems as it develops, then you can amend it. My problem with putting it as a one-line entry in the Constitution is that once it's there in the Constitution, it can't be changed by Parliament. It's just up to the High Court then to work out. For example, it was mentioned by Megan Davis that Centrelink would be one agency to which representations could be made. Now, if you're going to have that, how is the Voice to know that a public servant at Centrelink is going to make a decision about an Aboriginal person or a group of Aboriginal persons? Now, presumably, if the constitutional entity has a constitutional entitlement to make a representation, then a fortiori, they must have a constitutional entitlement to know that a public servant is contemplating making a decision. Otherwise, constitutional entitlement is meaningless, is it not? And yet, this is to be a sacred constitutional entitlement of those representing First Nations Australians. And if they're to have a constitutional entitlement to have noticed that a public servant is going to make a decision, then this is different from Parliament or the Minister, where there'll be stuff on the public record about what the law or the policy is. Then surely the entity would be entitled to receive some information first from the public servant, so as to be able to make what would be an informed representation. This is not fear-mongering. This is saying be careful what you put in the Constitution. So, my own view is that I would hope that the parliamentary committee process will allow us to come to a situation where ultimately it would be seen that yes, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and to Ministers of State of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And under Clause 3, that the Parliament have power to make laws with respect to the Voice, including giving powers for the Voice to make representations to public servants, to the Reserve Bank, to the Great Marine Park Authority, to Centrelink, etc. So, this is the space in which we will be for the next month or two. To conclude, I think that the real challenge for us is to identify that at the moment we have a situation where government, for understandable reasons, has decided that they will proceed as they have closely with the referendum working group of Aboriginal leaders, and all power to them. But in terms of getting to amend the Australian Constitution, and to do it overwhelmingly and as an act of unity, if you look at the politics of what's gone on in Australia in the last year or so, I would identify key Liberals like Julian Leeser and Andrew Bragg, who have indicated a willingness. We should be trying to get to the situation where there would be a formula of words that they would be prepared to support in the community at large, even if most of the Liberal Party decides to side with the National Party and say no. And we were given an indication of that last night by Peter Dutton. Peter Dutton said that for him as leader of the Liberal Party, he had managed to keep the party together, but that he had received criticism from many on the right of the party that he hadn't yet articulated their position on the Voice. That was code for saying he hadn't yet articulated that they were a unity ticket with the National Party, saying no. Now, I think that the Liberal Party to end up as a unity ticket with the National saying no to this would be disastrous. But equally, I think it would be disastrous if we go to a referendum with these words not being endorsed by any key Liberal. And as I say, this is all respect to the Aboriginal leaders, but it's to say, if you're trying to amend the Australian Constitution, even if it's in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it can't simply be the result of a deal cut between government and the Indigenous leaders, where there is then a parliamentary process which is truncated to a mere 6 weeks to say take it or leave it. Because the risk is that you'll have people in 3 of the 6 states saying, well, thank you, but we'll leave it. And I think that would be a disaster for the country. Thank you.